Okay, so get this. The global podcast industry just crossed $9.2 billion in revenue last year. That is not a typo. According to Owl & Co., that's a 23% jump year over year, and video is getting a lot of the credit. But here's the thing. We're going to stress test whether those video dollars are actually expanding the market or just inflating a headline while squeezing audio-native margins underneath. Then there's James Murdoch, reportedly dropping $300 million to pick up the Vox Media Podcast Network, New York Magazine, and the Vox brand through Lupa Systems. That is a big swing on human-led editorial audio. The strategic logic is interesting. The unit economics question lurking underneath? Also interesting. And then, plot twist, both Spotify and Amazon decided this was the week to launch AI-generated personalized podcast tools. Spotify through its Studio app and Investor Day, Amazon through Alexa Plus. Mid-tier general interest shows? You might want to pay attention. We've also got celebrity audio. The Jonas Brothers just launched a podcast with iHeart Podcasts, and LeBron James is taping live at Fanatics Fest. Two very different models. We'll break down why that distinction actually matters. All right, let's get into it, starting with $9.2 billion and what it actually means. We want to hear from you. Submit questions via the web form in the description or give us a call at 747-234-2678 and leave your question. Don't be shy. Our AI assistant makes it super easy. Okay, so get this. The global podcast industry just crossed $9.2 billion in revenue for 2025. $9.2 billion, up 23% year over year, according to a new report from Owl & Co. that dropped this week. Now, you could stop right there, put that number in a slide deck, and have a pretty good meeting. But here's the thing. The headline is almost beside the point. Inside Radio covered the Owl & Co. findings, and buried in the analysis is the real story. Video content is getting credit as the key driver of incremental growth, which sounds great until you ask the question I always ask, okay, but which part of that $9.2 billion is actually defensible margin? Because here's where it gets interesting. The moment you call a YouTube show a podcast, you've just invited a completely different set of CPM benchmarks into the conversation. You've also invited YouTube's ad stack, YouTube's audience data, and frankly, YouTube's cut. So the revenue number goes up, but where does it actually land? James Hale of RitTubeFilter published a sharp piece on this, asking what a podcast even is anymore when video is, quote, changing the picture. And I love that framing because it's not just philosophical hand-wringing, it has real budget implications. How buyers classify these shows determines which line item they pull from. Is it podcast spend? Is it digital video? Is it influencer? That classification fight is worth hundreds of millions in aggregate. The industry spent a decade arguing about download numbers. Now we get to argue about what format qualifies for the label. Progress. But look, here's what I'd be asking if I ran a network today. Of that $9.2 billion, how much is audio native revenue, the host-read ads, the dynamic insertion, the subscription fees, versus video adjacent dollars that are really just eating into a budget that used to belong to YouTube or connected TV? Because those are two different businesses with two different margin profiles. Forbes also ran a piece this week from Frank Rocchioppi noting that the growth story is not just domestic, this is a global number. International markets are pulling weight, which matters for anyone thinking about distribution infrastructure or language-specific content plays in 2026.
So the macro picture looks strong. 23% growth, global expansion, video adding surface area. All true. The bull case writes itself. But the stress test question, the one that actually matters for investment decisions, is this. If video is doing the heavy lifting on growth and video economics are structurally different from audio, then what is the podcast industry actually worth as a standalone asset? And that question gets very specific very fast when you look at who's writing nine-figure checks to get into this space right now. Who's buying, what they're paying, and whether the asset they're actually getting matches the story they're telling investors.
So, with that valuation in mind, who's actually writing checks right now? The answer dropped this week, and it's a name worth paying attention to. James Murdoch just agreed to buy New York Magazine, the Vox Media Podcast Network, and the Vox brand from Vox Media. According to reporting from Inside Radio and Al Jazeera, the deal is valued at more than $300 million. It closes under his Lupa Systems holding company, and the acquired properties operate as a new Vox Media subsidiary. The Verge, SB Nation, Eater, Popsugar, The Dodo, none of those are included. Now, I flagged this deal when it was in play back in March. What's changed is that it's now confirmed, and we have enough detail to stress test the math. So let me put on my PE hat for a second. $300 million. For what? A magazine brand that's storied but operating in a shrinking print-to-digital transition, a mid-tier podcast network with decent advertiser relationships and distribution infrastructure, and the Vox brand itself. The question I'd be asking in a deal memo, and honestly I heard versions of this from a couple of conversations this week, is which of those three assets actually justifies the multiple? Here's my read. The podcast network is the strategic anchor. Not New York Magazine, not the Vox brand alone. The podcast network gives Murdoch something advertisers care about right now, an audience that's measurable, loyal, and skewing to the premium demo that brand budgets chase. Al Jazeera's coverage put it plainly. The podcast division carries reach valued by advertisers. That's not filler language. That's the acquisition rationale in 5 words. But here's the unit economics problem. Mid-tier podcast networks are notoriously hard to value because the revenue is lumpy, the talent relationships are fragile, and catalog depth matters enormously. If your top 3 shows drive 60% of your downloads, you don't have a network, you have 3 shows with overhead. That's the stress test Murdoch's team had to run.
And this is where I keep drawing the 1990s radio consolidation parallel. When the big groups were rolling up stations back then, the pitch was always about scale and shared infrastructure. Sometimes the bundle justified the price. Often it didn't, because the underlying assets were weaker than the combined pitch made them look. Murdoch is betting on the bundle here. Premium editorial credibility from New York Magazine, advertiser infrastructure from the podcast network, and the content flywheel of the Vox brand. Whether that flywheel actually spins fast enough to generate the returns at $300 million plus is the open question. What I will say, Murdoch isn't a passive buyer. Lupa Systems has been deliberate about where it deploys capital. This is a bet on human-led, editorially driven audio and media at a moment when everyone else seems to be betting on machine-generated content, which, if you think about it, might be the most interesting tension in this space right now. Because while Murdoch is writing a $300 million check for editors and podcasters and a masthead with history behind it, 2 of the best capitalized technology companies on the planet are building systems designed to make that entire model optional. Spotify just launched an AI tool that generates a personalized daily podcast to each individual user. Amazon's Alexa Plus does the same thing on demand. And the question stops being about who bought what network. It becomes whether the network model itself survives what's coming next.
So, while James Murdoch is writing a $300 million check for human-led editorial audio, Spotify and Amazon are busy trying to make the whole concept irrelevant. Not a great week to be a mid-tier general interest podcast. Here's what's actually happening. Spotify used its Investor Day this week to announce personal podcasts, AI-generated audio built from your listening history, your calendar, and your inbox. The Verge's Stevie Bonifield reported that Spotify Studio, a standalone desktop app, can research topics online, pull from your notes and email, and generate a custom daily briefing for you specifically. And then Amazon comes in from the other side. Alexa Plus now produces AI-generated podcast episodes on demand on any topic you want, per People's coverage. You prompt it, it builds a show. Done. 2 different delivery models, same strategic ambition. Now, I've talked before about capabilities gaps closing, that the quality distance between AI-generated audio and human-hosted shows isn't a permanent moat. 6 months ago, network executives were treating AI podcasts as a curiosity, a lab experiment, something to monitor from a safe distance.
Both Spotify and Amazon are now treating this as a core product feature. That's a different conversation. The competitive angle here is worth sitting with. Spotify is positioning around personalization at the listening layer. They want your show to know you. Amazon is positioning around accessibility and convenience. Ask Alexa, get a podcast. These are not the same user behavior, and they're not going after the same moment, but they're both compressing the value proposition of general interest audio. Think about what a mid-tier news or culture show is actually selling. It's curation, it's perspective, it's the host knowing which 3 stories matter today and why. That's the product. And Spotify just told its Investor Day audience, per Podcast News Daily's coverage, that it can do that for each user individually, scaled to millions of people simultaneously.
The Q&A feature Spotify also announced, per TechCrunch's Ivan Mehta, is the quieter play here. Listeners can now interact with podcast content directly. That converts passive consumption into active engagement, which changes your metrics, your retention numbers, and eventually your CPM justification to advertisers. That's not a feature update. That's a different product. The Hollywood Reporter's Caitlin Huston noted Spotify framed personal podcasts around prompts like, and I'm quoting, "Share my daily city updates and tell me about local concerts from artists I love," which sounds delightful and also sounds like what every local radio station used to do before Clear Channel consolidated everything into oblivion in the 90s. I've seen this movie. The format survives. The middle of the market gets hollowed out. Now, some talent has a built-in insurance policy against all of this, audiences that no algorithm can manufacture from scratch, and that's a perfect segue into who's actually using that leverage right now. And here's the reality check to close us out. The insurance policy against AI hollowing out your audience is talent no algorithm can manufacture. So 2 deals this week that look similar on the surface and aren't. First, the Jonas Brothers launched Hey Jonas with iHeart Podcasts. Billboard and Insider Radio both covered it this week. Audio and video series, executive produced by all 3 brothers, built-in fan base, fans can call in with questions. This is the iHeart Network playbook executed cleanly. Established relationship with the band, talent with a proven audience de-risks the launch, and the press cycle alone anchors the sponsorship pitch. That's a podcast's business. Then there's LeBron. According to Bleacher Report, he's taping a live episode of his Mind the Game podcast at Thematics Fest in New York, July 16th, with Tyrese Halliburton as co-host, which is great. But that's an event revenue play wearing a podcast badge. The clips are distribution. The live audience is the product. 2 different models. One is a network building a content slate. The other is a live event business using audio as the hype engine. Measured, the pattern heading into the back half of 2026 is more of the latter. Talent managers have figured out the microphone is the cheapest IP monetization vehicle in the room. The question for networks is which of those deals actually builds an audience, and which just borrows one for a weekend. All right, that's a wrap on today's download. Big episode. The $9.2 billion headline is real, but the margin question underneath it, that's the one that keeps me up at night. And the Murdoch deal stress test? Still think the podcast network is the anchor. Everything else is window dressing.